Once upon a time, in a small, quiet suburban neighborhood, there lived a grumpy old man named Mr. Arthur McAllister. He was known throughout the town as the quintessential neighborhood grouch. Mr. McAllister had lived a long life, filled with bitterness and resentment. His tall and hunched frame, silver hair, and scowling face were well known to all. He would often sit on his porch, shaking his cane at anyone who dared to come too close to his property. Mr. McAllister's neighbor, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Her name was Mrs. Margaret Walker. She was a kind and friendly woman who radiated warmth and compassion. With her gentle smile and vibrant, welcoming garden, she was loved by everyone in the neighborhood. Her charm extended to her appearance, with her short and curly auburn hair and twinkling green eyes. She was the embodiment of the phrase, "the heart of gold." Their houses were right next to each other, separated only by a low white picket fence. The contrast between their homes was a physical representation of the stark differences in their personalities. Mr. McAllister's house was old and crumbling, with peeling paint and a neglected yard. On the other hand, Mrs. Walker's house was always adorned with colorful flowers and cheerful decorations. Life went on like this for many years. Mr. McAllister grew older and meaner, while Mrs. Walker continued to spread love and joy throughout the neighborhood. Their interactions were limited to the occasional irritated exchange over the picket fence when Mr. McAllister complained about the noise from Mrs. Walker's garden or the laughter of her grandchildren playing in her yard. One gloomy autumn day, as the leaves were falling from the trees and the air was crisp with the promise of winter, fate decided to intervene. Mr. McAllister had been feeling unusually weak for several days. He had a persistent cough, which only seemed to worsen as the days passed. But he was too stubborn to admit that he needed help or see a doctor. After all, in his mind, asking for help was a sign of weakness. As Mr. McAllister sat alone in his dimly lit living room, struggling to catch his breath, he suddenly collapsed onto the threadbare couch. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, and a searing pain shot through him. It was at this moment, in his darkest hour, that Mrs. Walker, with her kind heart and keen sense of neighborly duty, knocked on his front door. "Mr. McAllister, are you there?" Mrs. Walker called out, her voice filled with concern. She had noticed that his usually vigilant porch was uncharacteristically quiet. Mr. McAllister could barely respond, but he managed a faint, "Go away." The pain was excruciating, and his stubbornness hadn't waned, even in the face of a potential life-threatening situation. But Mrs. Walker was not one to be easily deterred. She had grown genuinely worried about her reclusive neighbor and knew that something was terribly wrong. She decided to take matters into her own hands and, with all her strength, pushed open Mr. McAllister's creaky front door. The sight that met her eyes was enough to send chills down her spine. Mr. McAllister was sprawled on the couch, his face contorted in agony. She rushed to his side, dialed 911, and stayed with him, providing what comfort she could. An ambulance arrived promptly, and Mr. McAllister was rushed to the hospital, his chest pains being treated with urgency. Mrs. Walker, still worried, followed him to the hospital, leaving her garden untended and her chores behind. In the hospital, the doctors managed to stabilize Mr. McAllister. He lay in the sterile hospital room, attached to various machines, reflecting on what had just transpired. Mrs. Walker sat in a chair beside him, holding his frail hand. The transformation in her neighbor was striking. His gruff exterior had crumbled, revealing a vulnerable, frightened old man. "Thank you," he whispered weakly, tears welling up in his eyes. "I thought I was a goner." Mrs. Walker smiled kindly and patted his hand. "You're not alone, Mr. McAllister. We're neighbors, after all." Over the next few days, Mrs. Walker continued to visit Mr. McAllister in the hospital, bringing him books, crossword puzzles, and homemade soup. They talked about their lives, their families, and the neighborhood they both called home. Mr. McAllister shared stories of his past and the regrets that weighed heavily on his heart. He had been a lonely man, having pushed everyone away with his anger and bitterness. As he began to recover, Mr. McAllister's heart began to heal as well. He realized that the kindness and compassion of his neighbor, Mrs. Walker, had given him a second chance at life. He knew that he needed to change, to be a better person, and to mend the relationships he had damaged. One day, as they sat in the hospital room, Mr. McAllister looked at Mrs. Walker with a newfound sense of humility. "Margaret," he said, using her first name for the first time, I've been such a wretched neighbor to you all these years, and yet you saved my life." Mrs. Walker smiled and gently replied, "Arthur, it's never too late to change. We all have our moments of darkness. What's important is that you've recognized your need for change and are willing to embrace it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Walker's family, who had come to visit her in the hospital. They were a close-knit and loving group, bringing warmth and laughter to the room. Mrs. Walker introduced Mr. McAllister to her children, grandchildren, and even her great-grandchildren. They were a lively bunch, and their presence brought joy to the otherwise sterile hospital room. As Mr. McAllister observed the genuine love and connection within Mrs. Walker's family, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of loneliness and regret. He had pushed everyone away, isolating himself in his bitterness. Seeing the happiness and togetherness that he had missed out on all these years was a painful revelation. After his recovery, Mr. McAllister was discharged from the hospital and returned to his old, decrepit house. But he was no longer the same man. He had made a promise to himself to change, to be kinder and more compassionate. He began by fixing up his yard and painting his house, transforming it from an eyesore into a respectable home. One day, he ventured over to Mrs. Walker's house and knocked on her door. When she answered, he cleared his throat nervously. "Margaret, I was wondering if you might teach me how to garden. I've realized I have a lot to learn about life, and I think I could use your guidance." Mrs. Walker's eyes twinkled with happiness, and she welcomed him into her garden with open arms. She taught him the names of various flowers, how to plant and care for them, and the joy of watching something beautiful grow from a tiny seed. As they worked side by side, their conversations flowed naturally, and Mr. McAllister slowly shed the layers of his gruff exterior. The neighbors in the quiet suburban neighborhood were astonished at the transformation in Mr. McAllister. He began to smile more, wave to passers-by, and even strike up conversations with fellow neighbors. He apologized to those he had been rude to in the past, and slowly but surely, he began to rebuild the bridges he had burned. It wasn't long before Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker became close friends. They shared meals, attended neighborhood events together, and even celebrated holidays as a united front. Mr. McAllister was no longer the evil old man, but rather a testament to the power of redemption and change. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in Mr. McAllister's newly transformed garden, he looked at Mrs. Walker with gratitude in his eyes. "You saved my life, Margaret, not just in the hospital, but in every sense of the word. You showed me that kindness and love are the true riches in life. I'll spend the rest of my days trying to make amends for the years I wasted being a bitter old man." Mrs. Walker smiled, her auburn hair gently ruffled by the breeze. "Arthur, it's never too late to change, and you've already made great strides. You found the true wealth of life, and that's a gift that can never be taken from you." As the years went by, Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker became inseparable. They were no longer just neighbors, they were family to each other. Their lives became intertwined, and they supported one another through the trials and tribulations of old age. Their love and friendship were a testament to the transformative power of kindness and the enduring beauty of second chances. In the end, Mr. Arthur McAllister's life had gone from one of bitterness and isolation to one filled with love, warmth, and the joy of shared experiences. He had learned the invaluable lesson that it's never too late to change, to mend broken relationships, and to be kind to others. His transformation was a beacon of hope to all who knew him, a reminder that even the grumpiest of souls can find redemption and happiness when they open their hearts to the beauty of human connection. And so, in that quiet suburban neighborhood, the story of Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker served as a reminder to all that a single act of kindness could change a person's life and ripple through a community, leaving a legacy of love and compassion for generations to come. As the seasons passed, the bond between Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker deepened. They spent their evenings in each other's company, sharing stories and laughter. Mr. McAllister was discovering a world he had long forgotten, a world filled with the beauty of flowers, the joy of sharing a meal, and the warmth of genuine friendship. Mrs. Walker's family had grown fond of Mr. McAllister, especially her granddaughter, Emily, a bright and curious young girl with a penchant for asking endless questions. Emily's inquisitiveness was met with patience and humor by Mr. McAllister, who found himself regaling her with stories from his long and eventful life. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Emily turned to Mr. McAllister with a gleam in her eye. "Mr. McAllister, do you have any stories from when you were a young man? You must have had some exciting adventures." Mr. McAllister chuckled. "Oh, I suppose I've had a few adventures in my time. Well, there was one particular story that comes to mind, a time when I traveled to far-off lands in search of treasure." Emily's eyes widened with fascination, and she leaned in closer, eager to hear more. "Many years ago," Mr. McAllister began, "I was a restless young man with a heart full of wanderlust. I decided to set off on a grand adventure to discover hidden treasures in a remote jungle. I gathered a small group of fellow explorers, and we set out on an expedition to a place no one had ever ventured before." He went on to describe the dense, lush jungle filled with exotic wildlife, the thrill of unearthing ancient artifacts, and the challenges they faced, including encounters with dangerous creatures and treacherous terrain. As he recounted his adventure, Mr. McAllister's eyes sparkled with the excitement of his youth. Mrs. Walker and Emily were captivated by the tale, hanging on his every word. They felt as if they were transported to the heart of the jungle, experiencing the adventure alongside him. The story opened up a new side of Mr. McAllister that no one had ever seen before. It was as if he had unlocked a hidden treasure within himself, the ability to share his experiences and emotions with others. Emily, in particular, had a newfound admiration for her neighbor. As the years went by, Emily continued to spend time with Mr. McAllister, learning about his life and the world through his stories. She had grown very fond of her elderly neighbor, and she often brought him books about adventure and exploration to feed his adventurous spirit. Mr. McAllister's garden had become a source of pride and a reflection of his transformation. The once neglected yard now bloomed with colorful flowers, and he took great pleasure in tending to it with Mrs. Walker's guidance. Passers-by marveled at the radiant transformation and couldn't help but comment on the beauty of his garden. His new disposition didn't go unnoticed in the neighborhood either. People who had been on the receiving end of his gruffness in the past were pleasantly surprised by his change of heart. The neighborhood began to take on a warmer and more inviting atmosphere, and it was clear that Mr. McAllister had played a pivotal role in that transformation. One day, Mrs. Walker suggested organizing a neighborhood picnic in her backyard. It was a chance for everyone to come together and enjoy good food, laughter, and camaraderie. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and preparations for the event began. As the day of the picnic arrived, the quiet suburban neighborhood was abuzz with excitement. Families gathered in Mrs. Walker's backyard, children played games, and adults shared stories and laughter. Mr. McAllister, now a central figure in the community, couldn't help but feel a profound sense of contentment. During the picnic, Mrs. Walker addressed the gathering, thanking everyone for coming and expressing her gratitude for the close-knit community they had built together. She then turned to Mr. McAllister and said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who has undergone a remarkable transformation and who has shown us the power of kindness and change. Our dear neighbor, Mr. McAllister, has proven that it's never too late to become a better person and to open your heart to the beauty of life." The neighbors, who had witnessed Mr. McAllister's journey of change, erupted into applause, and many came forward to express their appreciation for his kindness and generosity. Mr. McAllister, humbled and touched by the recognition, stood up and addressed the crowd. "I used to be a bitter, old man who drove people away with my gruffness. But thanks to Margaret and all of you, I've learned that the real treasures in life are not material wealth, but the relationships we build and the kindness we show to others. I'm grateful for the second chance you've all given me." The picnic continued with even more joy and laughter, with Mr. McAllister actively participating in the festivities. He played games with the children, shared stories with the adults, and his once shunned home had now become a gathering place for all. As the years continued to pass, the neighborhood thrived with a newfound sense of unity and warmth. Mr. McAllister's transformation had not only affected him, but had also inspired others to be kinder and more compassionate. He became a mentor to troubled teenagers in the neighborhood, helping them find their path and offering a listening ear. Mrs. Walker's garden continued to flourish, and she and Mr. McAllister shared many quiet moments together, watching the sunset and appreciating the simple beauty of life. Their friendship had grown into a deep and abiding love, one that was evident to anyone who saw them together. One autumn evening, as they sat on the porch, wrapped in warm blankets, Mr. McAllister turned to Mrs. Walker and said, "Margaret, I was a lonely man for most of my life, but you showed me the true meaning of companionship and love. I am so grateful for your presence in my life." Mrs. Walker smiled, her eyes filled with love and tenderness. "Arthur, you've brought joy and kindness into my life as well. I'm thankful every day for the friendship we share and for the man you've become." The neighborhood's story of transformation, love, and redemption had become legendary, and it continued to inspire everyone who heard it. It was a testament to the power of change, the importance of kindness, and the enduring beauty of human connection. In their quiet suburban neighborhood, Mr. Arthur McAllister and Mrs. Margaret Walker continued to live their days in love and happiness, a living testament to the profound impact one person can have when they open their heart to the world and learn to be kind. Their story, filled with warmth and hope, served as a reminder to all that it's never too late to change, to mend broken relationships, and to make a positive difference in the lives of those around us. As the seasons changed, so did the lives of Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker. Their friendship had grown into something much more profound. They became inseparable, supporting each other through the ups and downs of their elderly years. Mr. McAllister had fully embraced his new outlook on life, and he reveled in the simple joys of their daily routines. They would often spend their mornings sitting on the porch, sipping tea, and watching the world go by. As they gazed out at the neighborhood, Mr. McAllister couldn't help but chuckle at the memories of his grumpy past. "Margaret, I can hardly believe I used to be such a sour old man. I can't thank you enough for showing me the beauty in everyday life." Mrs. Walker smiled, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight. "Arthur, you've shown me the power of change and redemption. We all have our pasts, and what matters is who we are now." Their laughter and stories echoed through the neighborhood, spreading warmth and a sense of hope. People passing by would often pause to exchange a few words with them, and the once feared Mr. McAllister had become a source of wisdom and comfort for the community. But it wasn't just their daily routines that changed, their lives took on new dimensions. Mr. McAllister, who had once been isolated and alone, was now a cherished member of a close-knit circle of friends and neighbors. One of his dearest friends was Mr. Henry Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who lived a few houses down the street. Mr. Jenkins was a gentle soul with a passion for history and a penchant for storytelling. His warm smile and hearty laugh were infectious, and he was known for his ability to captivate audiences with his tales of the past. One summer evening, as the sun set, Mr. McAllister, Mrs. Walker, and Mr. Jenkins gathered on the porch, ready for another evening of shared stories and laughter. Mr. Jenkins, with his ever-present stack of historical books, began to regale them with a story from the past. "Did you know," he started, "that this very neighborhood has a history that dates back over a century? There's a tale about the original settlers who established these houses and the challenges they faced." As Mr. Jenkins painted a vivid picture of the neighborhood's history, Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker listened with rapt attention. They were transported back in time, learning about the families who had once lived in these houses and the struggles they had overcome. It was a remarkable evening, one that deepened their appreciation for the community they lived in. It also sparked an idea in Mr. McAllister's mind. He approached Mr. Jenkins after the storytelling session. "Henry, I was thinking, why don't we organize a neighborhood history project? We could document the stories of the families who have lived here over the years. It would be a wonderful way to honor the past and bring the community even closer together." Mr. Jenkins's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Arthur, that's a fantastic idea. I have a treasure trove of old photographs and documents that we can use. Let's make this a reality." And so, the Neighborhood History Project was born. Mr. McAllister, Mrs. Walker, and Mr. Jenkins set out to interview the older residents and collect stories and photographs. They discovered tales of love, hardship, and perseverance, and the project quickly gained momentum. As word spread about the project, other neighbors joined in, sharing their own family histories and contributing artifacts. It became a community effort, with everyone realizing that they were part of a rich tapestry of lives, all woven together in the same neighborhood. The project culminated in a neighborhood history exhibition held in the local community center. The walls were adorned with photographs and stories, and the event brought generations of residents together. The exhibition was a celebration of the past and a reminder of the enduring sense of community that had developed in the neighborhood. During the exhibition, Mr. McAllister stood proudly beside a display of his own family's history, sharing stories with visitors and basking in the sense of connection he now felt. It was a far cry from the recluse he had once been, and he couldn't have been happier. But the transformation didn't stop there. Inspired by the success of the History Project, Mr. McAllister suggested another initiative. "Margaret, what if we start a community garden? We can create a space where neighbors can come together, get their hands dirty, and cultivate beautiful flowers and produce." Mrs. Walker's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Arthur, that's a wonderful idea. A community garden will not only beautify our neighborhood, but also provide a place for people to bond and share their love for nature." With the support of their neighbors, they broke ground for the community garden. People of all ages, from children to seniors, came together to till the soil, plant seeds, and tend to the garden. The once neglected neighborhood was now teeming with life, color, and a renewed sense of purpose. The garden became a gathering place, a spot where people would come to chat, share gardening tips, and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Children played among the flowers, seniors exchanged stories, and friendships flourished amid the blossoms and vegetables. As time passed, the neighborhood's reputation as a close-knit, friendly community spread beyond its boundaries. It became a model for other neighborhoods, inspiring them to foster a sense of togetherness and build strong, lasting connections among neighbors. One sunny afternoon, Mr. McAllister and Mrs. Walker sat on their porch, watching the children play in the community garden. He turned to her and said, "Margaret, I never thought I would see the day when this neighborhood would be so full of life and love. Thank you for showing me the way." Mrs. Walker smiled, her eyes filled with contentment. "Arthur, you've shown everyone the power of transformation and the beauty of kindness. It's never too late to change, and you've proven that." Their story, a tale of redemption and renewal, continued to inspire others to let go of bitterness and embrace the beauty of life and human connection. The once grumpy Mr. McAllister and the ever-kind Mrs. Walker were living proof that change was possible and that even the coldest hearts could thaw with the warmth of friendship and compassion. In the heart of their quiet suburban neighborhood, the lives of Mr. Arthur McAllister and Mrs. Margaret Walker had become a testament to the enduring power of love, community, and the transformative nature of the human spirit. Their journey had not only touched their lives but had also left an indelible mark on the world around them, reminding everyone that it was never too late to change and that kindness had the power to heal even the deepest wounds of the heart.